discuss his work? I mean, for instance, the imagination, or did someone tip him off in American Tabloid, for instance? I can understand it, but the American Tabloid is so weaves so close to what might have happened. I just wondered where he got that from or how he worked.
We did discuss his work, but the general rule when interviewing a novelist is they don't like to talk about their work because they feel that's your job. They don't want to give away too many secrets. But I mean, Ellroy's such a brilliant talker. There were times when I just felt I could just publish the transcript and it would sell out every book that year. Is that he weaves conversationally from one thing to the next. So it was difficult for him to discuss his parents with me, but occasionally, like, he'd hear a song like we're played now, and suddenly that would remind him of something. And he would talk about his work. So with reference to American Tabloid, he said, I wanted people to wonder about the historical verisimilitude about it. That's why he has that direct address prologue to the reader, which he hadn't done before. That was distinct. That was distinctly to say to the reader, you're going to read some history now, and to get them pondering. And he talked about previous books that focused on the JFK assassination and wanted to make his different, and of course the Oliver Stone film, which had been huge in 1991 and making it very different from the Oliver Stone film, which was about the district attorney, the Jim Garrison investigation. And Ellroy makes it so different. He doesn't mention Jim Garrison. He barely mentions Oswald. The way he does it is just like, well, I don't have to mention Oswald. It's not important to my particular version of events. So yeah, we talked about it. That's the one we can. Yeah.
Anything else? Oh yes.
I presume that the decision about how much of the life and how much of the work should be discussed was a very important one that you must have had to make up your mind about early on.
Yeah. It depended on how many people would talk to me, and I found out that almost all of them talked to me. So the partners, I felt like that had to be taught because Ellroy weaves his life into his fiction. So, for instance, something like Bloods of Rover, where you have the relationships the characters are having with women, the idea of a kind of, right-wing, reactionary, irredeemable men having these relationships with left-wing women is almost exactly Ellroy's personal life. He dates almost exclusively women who have polar opposite views to himself. So, and they were based on actual women in his life. So my job was to go out, and talk to them and see what were the parallels between the novel, which is of course fiction, and things that really happened. Even the smallest things like there are scenes in the novel where Ellroy's describing the toys in the bedroom or things like that, and of course they'd be accurate. Like I say, it's often a balancing act. And do you think you've done it right? I mean, you do your absolute best you can, but I feel like for me, Ellroy's personal life and his literary life are so interlinked. Just take the murder of his mother. If you're talking about, say, the Black Dahlia, you've got to talk about the murder of his mother because it's two murdered women. That's the story, an unsolved crime. And so getting the balancing act right is just a constant challenge. Yeah.
Any questions?
Was the lockdown and COVID a benefit or an impedance on your project?
Well, I think it was a benefit in terms of it made the interviews more intimate. And Ellroy is a great believer in the good old-fashioned handheld film. And I became a great believer in the good old-fashioned handheld film because there was something about being on the phone for hours to someone and the darkness begins to sweep in from outside and you're in a darkened room and it's just your voice and their voice and the crackle of electricity on the line. It's extremely intimate. But of course, I got him involved in Zoom. I managed to, he's still handwriting all his novels. He hates technology, but I managed to get him onto Zoom. And so, yes, I was grounded for a lot of it, but in the digital age, in the internet age, places I've been to previously, like his archive at the University of South Carolina, they could just send me back stuff that I wanted, and I was just on the phone, on the Zoom, on Teams, just every day, just round the clock, getting it done. So I don't know, maybe without lockdown it would have been different, but all our lives would have been different. So yeah. So was the question at the back?
Yeah. In your conversations with him, was there anything off limits? Did he ever shut you down over any of your questions?
No, he was never in a curt way. No, we like I say, I think we were friends and are friends. But he is a great. I think 90% of charm is evasion, and he could be very, very evasive. If I felt like I was heading towards a trigger, because I think if you're dealing with someone with trauma, then obviously there's a sensitive conversation. So you're feeling the way and you're wondering how intimate it could be. But I would say that he is a tad manic. So there were times when we'd talk for hours and then he said, oh, next time I'm going to give you the full scoop on this, and call him back next week, he didn't want to talk about it. So I was just like, I've done all the prep for that, So there were times when you're kind of massaging his ego a little bit, or just realizing that this is an eccentric guy.
And would you press him maybe in subsequent interviews, or would you just drop it?
Not so much press as hint. Like I say, I'm a firm believer in two things. One, the interviewer should talk very little. And I did. I just let him talk. So it became almost monologues. And I could just follow it. It would be like a stream of consciousness monologue. And then if I could just tilt the conversation a certain way, then I could just drop a line here, there, or just drop a tangential line and see if that would get him talking about it. I mean, the fact is, there were quite a few sensitive subjects, so if you didn't want to talk about one, well, maybe if you brought up another one, you'd think, oh, I've got out of that. So you just talk about that, so you're just zigzagging over these issues. But broadly speaking, I think we've got it very comprehensive. We've covered almost everything. And like everything he says has to be fact-checked as well.
How did you first meet him?
I did my PhD on him at the University of Liverpool, and we established contact, and we began talking on the phone. That's always been our greatest medium, talking on the phone. And then during that PhD, went to his archive in South Carolina and went out to meet him where he was living at the time in some marvelous place called the Ravenswood in Los Angeles. That was his second divorce pad. That was his runaway pad. But the Ravenswood was built by Paramount Pictures in the 30s, I think, to house contract players, studio contract players. It's an Art Deco building, and his apartment going in is a very rickety old lift that doesn't work. His apartment was, because he's now moved to Denver, entirely red walls, black furniture, a very sheeny wooden floor, and just pictures of old LA crimes, like the Black Dahlia or various gangland shootings. It really was like walking into a serial killer's house. But he's always funny about it. He's with a very modern sense of humour. And in that particular meeting, when we talked, he decided to lie back on this long black fainting couch, and it's just like he's like, okay, you're Freud. You ask the questions, and he'd lie back there. But it was always great. But the thing is with showbiz and literary life is you don't see people for years. And this is the thing I learned about Hollywood is that if you're working on a project, you deal with someone intensely. You're in their life for hours every day, and you form this close bond, and then you just never see them again once it's all over for years at a time. But actually, Ellroy and I have kept in touch. So by Hollywood standards, we've done pretty well, because in that world, it's very easy to have a falling out. It's very difficult to have a reconciliation.
How do you recall all this information over these years that you're gathering? Do you record conversations? Are you making notes at the time? How do you do it?
I record the conversations, yeah. And in a sense, although I got the contract in January 2020, the book was published this month. But really, so that's 3 years. But before that, you've got 20 years or 15 or 20 years of making notes, filing it away, having conversations. Every little tidbit, every little factoid, I think, to me, is narrative, and fitting that into a narrative and putting it all together. So I am recording the conversations, unless I'm asked not to,
Yes.
which for legal reasons, one or two people did ask, and I will say that the book went through a tough legal read, because if you're writing about living people, it gets very, very complicated. So the legal read was 3 days with a wonderfully tough streetwise New York lawyer. It was 3 days of meetings, and he'd done all the legal reads for all the great books for the past 50 years. Because this book is about publishing, he's like, "Oh, Steve, I've done a lot of legal reads. This is the first book where I knew everybody in the book." And he was wonderfully funny. First of all, of course, the rule in the United States is you can't libel dead. So we go through the list of characters like, "Is this person dead?" "Yes." Apparently in France and Germany you can be sued for libel if you badmouth somebody's dead great grandfather, but the damages are so small that it doesn't really matter. Yes, he was. Elliot was wonderful, because he'd be reading it, he'd be like, "Oh, Asimov, I remember Asimov, yeah. Oh yeah, he had so many affairs, he'd always come into the office begging in advance. Isaac Asimov, it's like, I've taken this one to the Bahamas, I'm totally broke, please will you give me an advance?" And it's just, I've got science fiction friends, I'm just like, oh, they would love that. They're never really fun. But you do see a different side to people, you know. Oh yeah, so, sorry.
Is there anything left unwritten in the book that you wish you could have included?
Yeah, I think every time you do a book, every time you do a big project, be it a book or a PhD or anything, there's probably one thing about it that'll break your heart. And but that's good, because you can save that for the next one. And even writing this, towards the end, I began to see the kind of narrative lines begin to converge into something else, a different story, but which, you know, I will just file away at the back of my mind and just maybe take out a year or two from now. I don't know. We will see. Yeah. So
The book seems ripe for a transition to screen. Are you got eyes on a documentary?
There's been a number of interest, yeah. I had a close call, it was sad. Brian Helgeland, the Oscar-winning screenwriter of LA Confidential, he was interested. Unfortunately, turned down in the end because he said, well, I was too volatile. He said, you know, he's the way he put it is like, Ellroy likes so little of modern day films, he wouldn't want to make it and potentially upset him. So Brian Helgeland was a close on this, but there's also been talk of documentaries, but yeah, these things percolate, they take time. So, you know, I think it'd be it's very visual, it's very fast paced. In fact, the review in the Times Literary Supplement said, compared to most literary biographies, this one has prose that reads like gunfire. So I was quite pleased with that line.
Have you got that in your kitchen?
A few of the clippings, yeah, I keep them with my fridge magnets, yeah.